Okay, well, welcome back everyone from the break. For this next section, we have two speakers who will be addressing Secretary of Interior standards and how they can apply it in the context of managing change in historic districts. With that, I'd like to introduce Marissa Moshier and Kelly Ribuffo from the City of Orange. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm Marissa Moshier. I'm the Historic Preservation Planner for the City of Orange. I'm here with Kelly, who is my colleague, also works on historic preservation projects here in Orange in the Planning Division. So we are going to talk about the Secretary standards in the context of local government and the regulatory framework related to the Secretary standards, and then give you a couple of example projects. Since I have a captive audience, I'll also tell you a little bit about the history of our historic preservation program in Orange and kind of situate you, since you are here in Orange, and we'll hopefully be able to take a little walk and visit our historic plaza at lunch. So the historic preservation program in Orange really started in the late 70s, 1980s into the 1990s. We had a very active community that was starting to realize that there were a number of demolitions of historic houses happening in Old Town, and really came together to encourage the city to survey our historic resources and then designate them both at the local level and in the National Register. So do I have a pointer here? No. There should be one somewhere. Somewhere? No, not that. Anything? Oh, there. Oh, there we go. Thank you. So we are right about here in this building. If you walk a couple of blocks south and east, you'll end up in the plaza. You might have driven through our little roundabout. That is Plaza Park, right at the center of our Old Town Historic District, which is shown here. The Plaza Park itself was designated in the National Register in 1978. The larger Plaza Historic District, which is our commercial downtown, the orange outline, was designated in the National Register in 1982. And then we have the larger Old Town Historic District, which includes the residential neighborhoods around the historic district. That was designated in the National Register in 1997, and then at the local level in kind of the early 90s. Am I doing that? Unintentional? Okay, good. Oh, great, thank you. I'm like, so as part of that, that designation effort, we also developed design standards for the historic district that I'll go into as well. But since this is really about a topic about the Secretary standards, I wanted to talk a little bit about how the Secretary standards come into play in the policy and regulatory documents that the city uses to make up our historic preservation program. So the first of those is our general plan. And for those of you who aren't necessarily on the planning side, the general plan is the city's kind of guiding policy document adopted by City Council. And it talks about what the city and the community want to see for the future development of Orange and how we're going to accomplish that future development. So there are elements that are part of the general plan, like land use, circulation, safety. And one of those elements that the city can adopt is a historic preservation element. So the city has had a historic preservation element since 1982, most recently updated in 2010. And with that update in 2010, we specifically talked about identifying and preserving potential and listed historic resources as a kind of overarching goal for the city's historic preservation program. And then more specifically, we talk about providing long-term assurance that historic resources will be used, maintained, and rehabilitated in conformance with the Secretary standards. So that lays out for staff kind of a foundation from City Council that says when we're developing design standards and other policy documents for the historic preservation preservation program, we're going to develop them so that they're in conformance with the Secretary standards. And one of those policy documents is the design standards for Old Town that I just mentioned. Those were first adopted in 1995 and last updated in 1999. They, in their current form, reference the Secretary standards. But basically, it's the rehabilitation standards are attached as an appendix to that document. So it's not folded into the main text of our design standards in the way that we would necessarily like. So we are currently working on an update to those design standards that is now out for public comment as of June 7th. It's a 2-year effort, so we're very excited about the update. The update really attempts to tie our local design standards much more closely to the Secretary standards and the guidelines. So it makes reference to all of the preservation briefs and the technical notes and all of the kind of guidance documents from the National Park Service in the actual text of the design standards. So we're bringing our policy documents into greater conformance with those standards. I wanted to mention briefly too for you on the planning side, we also have a set of local CEQA guidelines that reference the Secretary standards and talk about specific categories for categorical exemptions involving historic resources and conformance with the Secretary standards. That's kind of beyond the scope of this. If you want more information on our local CEQA guidelines, though, feel free to talk to me afterwards. And then I'm going to turn it over to Kelly to talk a little bit about specific plans and how the Secretary standards come into play with our specific plans.
So because the Old Town Historic District is so large, it's almost a square mile in size, and we have a lot of really big players and organizations that are based in Old Town, the city has adopted several specific plans that kind of address certain quadrants of the city in order to try to bring a little bit more order to how development and planning moves forward. And also, through those documents, we can be more specific about guidance on how to apply the Secretary of Interior standards as projects are brought forward over time. One of those, as you're probably familiar since we are in one of their buildings today, is Chapman University. The university has been in Orange for almost over 60 years now, since the 1950s, and has continued to expand, especially over the last 25 years. So the Chapman University specific plan is designed to kind of address the university's goals and growth needs, and also try to balance how development happens in Old Town. So the map here kind of shows you the boundaries of the specific plan area. We're over here right now in the Digital Media Arts Center building, which used to be the Anaconda Cable Wire Factory. But the university also has several other major historic resources in its specific plan boundary, including the old Union High School, which is a National Register listed historic site. That's the original high school that was built here in Orange, with buildings dating from the 19-teens and the 1930s. There's also a historic packing house, Citrus Packing House, that was originally, the first part was constructed in 1918 and has been expanded since that time, as well as many other single-family residences that the university has adapted to either be office buildings or for faculty housing. So the university has a very large presence in the historic district. So in response to that, the university, in conjunction with the city, adopted a specific plan. The original version of that was adopted in 1989. The most recent version, Amendment 6, was adopted in 2012. And in that document, we have a set of specific historic preservation and enhancement guidelines that are based on the Secretary of Interior standards, but are really tailored to try to address perhaps some of the projects that the university is interested in moving forward as they continue to grow and develop. And those really especially focus on either adaptive reuse or infill development in the historic district. I'll turn it back over to Marissa briefly, and then I'll be back.
The other specific plan that we wanted to mention, because it plays into a couple of projects that we'll be talking about in a little bit, is our Santa Fe Depot specific plan. That is a specific plan that addresses basically the area around the historic railroad corridor. So the building that we are in is actually just adjacent to the railroad. The railroad is right here. It includes a historic train depot and a number of large industrial buildings related to the citrus packing industry that was very prominent here in Orange historically. It also contains a little bit of a residential neighborhood that was historically our Cypress Street barrio, primarily Mexican and Mexican-American families living in the neighborhood of the citrus packing industry. So that specific plan really delves into the character and preservation of industrial buildings. So the specific plan is written to talk about the preservation of packing houses and the kind of character, both exterior and interior, of those large-scale industrial buildings. And it draws really heavily on the National Park Service's guidance specific to industrial buildings. So those are a set of design standards in the specific plan that we are looking at anytime we are reviewing a project within the boundaries of that specific plan. Oh, and Kelly.
And just briefly to mention two other specific plans that we have. Old Town also has the presence of several churches, specifically Lutheran churches that were established during the early history of the city. And two of them, St. John's Lutheran, which was originally constructed around 1918, and Immanuel Lutheran, which was constructed around 1924, also have their own specific plans, because both of these organizations have large private schools associated with them. So the impact of that can, from a planning perspective, can potentially be great. So each of them has also adopted their own specific plan that really kind of addresses how they're going to potentially operate and impact the character of the historic district as well. So with that framework in mind, we've kind of put together a list of some example projects we'd like to go through with you that kind of address different city projects, institutional projects, and residential projects, and how they interact with those different documents that we just went through with you, and how the city uses them to apply the Secretary of the Interior standards as we're reviewing these projects. And we're going to start with the Metrolink parking structure, which Marissa can discuss with you.
So our Metrolink parking structure is an example of new construction, infill construction in our historic district. So we're looking primarily at standards 9 and 10 for new construction related to a historic resource. For our purposes, when we're talking about infill construction in a historic district, we consider the entire historic district to be the historic resource. So we're thinking about how the infill construction fits in with the character of the historic district and how it could potentially impact the character defining features of the historic district as a whole. So this is a project proposed for a surface parking lot, currently a surface parking lot in the historic district. So DMAC is right about there, and here's the project site right here. DMAC is up here in this corner. Here's the project site. This is Chapman Avenue and Lemon. So if you walk to lunch, you will probably walk by the surface parking lot where this is proposed. So it's within the boundaries of our Old Town Historic District, just on the edge of the Plaza Historic District, really adjacent to the west end of Chapman University's campus. And just adjacent to the Santa Fe Depot, which is the train station still used by Metrolink today. So it's a proposal for a parking lot primarily for Metrolink transit riders, with some public parking available for the city. It's a breakdown of about 500 parking spaces for transit riders and about 111 parking spaces for general public use. So this is the surface parking lot today, very nondescript. There is a non-historic fast food restaurant right here that will remain, actually. There are some historic buildings immediately adjacent to the site and right across the street from the site. This neighborhood really is kind of in a transitional space between the more commercial development of the plaza and the kind of industrial development that's along the railroad corridor. So we have examples of these kind of truss, fairly high volume, large historic industrial buildings. That's a masonry example, and pretty modest but very early 1900s houses, all kind of jumbled together in this interesting neighborhood. So when we are thinking about the potential impacts of this project and how it fits in, we're thinking about kind of the scale of the surrounding development, what the neighborhood pattern is, how is the scale of the new construction going to impact the character of that streetscape. So here's the proposal. It's a very large building. We can't get away from the fact that it's a very large building. This project has a lengthy history. It originally involved the redevelopment agency and was kind of midstream when redevelopment went away. So was paused for about 18 months, almost 2 years, while we worked out issues with the successor agency to redevelopment. It involves funding from OCTA and some federal money. So there's a Section 106 process that it has to go through as well. There are a lot of players involved in this. And there was a lot of talk early on about kind of creative solutions to fitting this building within the historic district, including wrapping it with retail and even housing at one point. But ultimately, because of all of the different funding sources and the dissolution of the redevelopment agency, we ended up with solely a parking structure. So the challenge for staff and the design team was to make a very large parking structure fit within our historic district. So the design team took a look at the surrounding commercial buildings and picked up on some of the details that you can see throughout the historic district in those commercial buildings. The pattern of the window openings, the concrete base, this kind of flat roof parapet form, to try and give the building at least some pedestrian scale and some kind of a rhythm that fits in with both the commercial buildings and the industrial buildings in the historic district. This is the Anaconda Wire Company, the building we're in today at the corner. So you can see a little bit of how we're picking up the scale and the form of these windows throughout the building to give it a little bit more of a pedestrian scale, at least when you are walking down the street. And then there was a lot of concern from the neighborhood about privacy issues. So this is the interior side of the parking structure. These are private single-family residences, and really did not want to have people in the parking structure looking down onto their backyard. So this elevation really is only broken up by those kind of pilasters, but very purposefully to deal with some neighborhood issues there. And then this is just an example of kind of the scale of the building within the broader historic district. And I think here is where it's helpful to think about the scale of the historic industrial buildings that are in the neighborhood. This is a historic industrial building. This is as well. This is the DMAC building that we're in today. So there are a number of large, very large industrial buildings in the neighborhood that we tried to draw from to kind of fit the scale of this building into the historic district. One of the things that I wanted to mention too, and I don't know if I have a detail of this, no, I don't. We spent a very long time talking about the finish material of this building. It's a concrete building that's clad in brick. And we had very, very lengthy conversations about how the brick was treated at the corners and at all of the returns on all of those window and door openings. And this is where I think it's useful to think about the secretary standards through the lens of the community that you're working in, because Orange, I think, takes a pretty conservative approach to interpreting, especially standards 9 and 10. I think there's intentionally some flexibility in kind of the infill, the standards that surround infill and new construction, particularly in historic districts. And Orange, I think, tends more toward the kind of historicist approach. So there might be communities who would like to see that this is truly a concrete building. I wouldn't care so much about how the brick returns on those openings. But in Orange, we care very much that the building is detailed in a way that makes sense for a historic or traditional building material. So despite the fact that the scale and the size of the building were certainly hard for everyone to come to terms with, it ended up being very important, I think, to the community and to staff and to our decision makers, how all of that was detailed so that it makes sense for the historic district overall.
All right, so I'm going to move on to a smaller scale project than the Metrolink parking structure, but still located in the same neighborhood. So several years ago, Chapman University was offered the donation of a very large California art collection, I think over 500 pieces, by the Hilbert family. And the university wanted to be able to establish an appropriate venue to display and store that art. Looking at their specific plan area, one of the buildings that they owned that was underutilized is this industrial building located between Atchison and Cypress Street. So down here, it's about a block. So we're here at the Digital Media Arts Center, and it's about a block south. The property is located directly adjacent to our Santa Fe Depot building. It's located right in the heart of our Santa Fe Depot specific plan area that encourages kind of a development of this area as more of a commercial, creative, cultural kind of uses. Also, it is located in the Chapman University specific plan area, and of course in the boundaries of our Old Town Historic District. So there's a lot of different planning documents that kind of overlay this site and a lot of different intents. So obviously the university has their own educational mission, and in this case, the specific goal of trying to adaptively use this building for an art gallery, and also part of a dance studio. Since here's the Digital Media Arts Center where we are now. The building here that's kind of wrapped in vines is their dance school, and this building is directly adjacent to that. So there are a lot of different things at play in the larger neighborhood. As Marissa said, this area is also part of the historic Cypress Street Barrio neighborhood. So it is a mix of residential and heavy industrial uses. And because it's right next to our depot where we have our entrance to Orange through the Metrolink train station, they wanted to be able to have a presence with that. So this is what the building looked like prior to the project. It's a 1971 tilt-up construction building. It originally had 4 industrial warehouse bays, had undergone several changes over time. You can see this bay had been widened in kind of a very non-structurally safe way. The back lot here, where all of the loading and unloading happen, actually faces the depot. So the back of the building faces the train station, whereas the office side, which is this side, faces Cypress Street, away from the train station. The building itself is considered to be a non-contributing building within the historic district. It had some architectural interest kind of with these arched entrances, which are actually structural to the building. But overall, we affectionately called them the Taco Bell arches. But overall, the city determined that the building still qualifies as non-contributing within the district because it's not only outside of the period of significance, it's been altered heavily and really doesn't have that much unique architectural character. So since this project is really talking about infill development, and we're talking really about standards 9 and 10, what we asked the university's design team to do is really look at the context of the neighborhood that the building is located in to try to draw inspiration on how to adaptively reuse the building. So the building right here in question was built in 1971, directly across the street from the train station, and is really surrounded by a mix of kind of early to mid-century industrial buildings, as well as some residential as well. So it's kind of a hodgepodge of industrial buildings with really no dominant, particularly dominant industrial design styles. So we kind of encouraged the university to be creative in the way that they approached the design of this building. One of the main goals of their project was, instead of having the front of the building face Cypress Street here away from the depot, they wanted to change the front of the building to the Atchison Street side, so it would more interact with the depot, and also maybe draw more visitors into the museum. And they also really wanted to be able to put parking here for the museum and do some additional landscaping. So in conjunction with review from the city, they kind of came up with what I would describe to be it's a contemporary but mid-century inspired kind of renovation to the building. So they were going to keep the existing scale of the building. They weren't going to do any additions, but they were going to kind of do a cutout here for a main entrance, some additional lighting, and then on the Cypress Street side, which is now the front of elevation, the Taco Bell arches would be, one moment.
I'll fix that. Where's that keyboard? Sorry.
Oh boy.
I advanced your slides.
That's right, got it. So the those Taco Bell arches would be covered up to try to create more standard doorways and privacy for what would be the new rear of the building. Now, as far as materials went, we also asked them to look at what was predominantly being used in the area to try to pick materials out that made sense in the industrial context for the building, but again, would still make the building stand out as essentially a new contemporary development. So they actually took a lot of inspiration from materials from the building we're in now, the Digital Media Arts Center. The building was originally concrete, so they maintained the concrete, painted concrete, added corrugated metal, and then also they wanted to be able to add some decorative brick planters and kind of wainscoting to the building. The university over time has developed a very specific design style that's sort of unique to them. And one of the highlights of that design style is kind of what they have a proprietary brick blend called Chapman blend that they use on a lot of their newer buildings and reuses. So they wanted to be able to incorporate that into the building as well to really make it feel like a cohesive, so it would cohesively blend in with the rest of the university. So this is actually an approach to design that is a bit more creative and forward thinking than a lot of the previous adaptive reuses that we've had in Orange. But because of the area that it's located in, we felt that we could kind of step more outside the box and try to do something that was a little bit more creative. So just so you can see it really quickly, this is the footprint of the building. This is where that kind of that back lot loading area was. And they were able to try to provide some additional street trees and landscaping that sort of tied in with not only the city's street tree plan, but the planting plan for the university. So this is what it looks like today. Since this building is so close, I highly encourage all of you to take a walk by and visit while you're on your lunch break if you've got an opportunity. The museum is free and open to the public. But we were, I would say, as someone who worked on this project, it's probably one of the more creative projects that I've worked on. And I think we were really happy with the way that it ended up kind of balancing the character of the neighborhood, giving the university what it wanted as part of its university identity, but also implemented some of our infill goals for this particular neighborhood where we want to be able to bring in more uses like this, but still respect the historic character and scale. So this is that elevation where the Taco Bell arches used to be. So I'm going to let Marissa talk about Plaza Park now.
Right, this is a project that happened about 15 or 16 years ago now, actually. But I think it's useful because it brings in a little bit of discussion about landscape and kind of talks about ongoing maintenance and how we're ensuring that maintenance and preservation are happening in conformance with the Secretary standards at a city level for city facilities. So this is Plaza Park. In 1887. This is the center of the roundabout in our historic district. In its very earliest days, the city was laid out around this plaza. Chapman and Glassell, the two people who kind of developed and laid out the city, initially set aside 8 lots in the center of the city, specifically for a plaza. And over time, it developed into this kind of roundabout character with a park and a fountain at the center, and this specific arrangement of walkways. So in its earliest days, it was not really planted, had a cast iron fountain with little egrets on it at the center, and unpaved walkways, and really very minimal curbs in its earliest days. And then started to be developed a little bit more. You can start to see the roundabout character a couple years later, a few more mature plantings with palm trees, an actual curb, and bollards around the very outside of the park. Here it is in 1915. So you start to see the roadway being paved. It's still mainly unpaved paths here, but much more mature plantings over time. And you start to see the development of the plaza, commercial buildings in the background. Those kind of early 20th century masonry buildings start to be developed. The fountain at the center is still the same at this point. 1920 here, you can see a detail of that fountain, the 3 tiers, concrete basin, and actual paving in the park with these concrete curbs. And here it is by 1932. The walkways have been paved with this scored, diagonally scored and integrally colored concrete, and much more mature plantings. The trees have really grown up. You start to see more curbs along the outside and those bollard and chain detail around the exterior, the paved roads. By 1937, the fountain had been changed out, so now it's a tile basin, colored tile basin, and the single tiered metal fountain in the center. You can see a detail of that scored concrete as well. Cypress trees around the fountain and really mature palms by this point. And here it is in 1960. Again, those mature palm trees, the cypresses growing up around the fountain with that tile basin, the scored concrete walkways and curbs with the bollard and chain. So by the late 1990s and really early 2000, the park was in pretty poor condition. A lot of the plantings still remained, but the paving in the park itself was pretty severely deteriorated. And the city started looking at doing an improvement project to the park itself. So the park was listed in the National Register by this point. It was listed in 1978, Plaza Historic District in 1982. And the city had a pretty developed historic preservation program by this point. Despite all of that, there was a proposal for pretty substantial changes to the character of the park at this point. We have Jeff Frankel from OTPA here. I'm sure he can talk a little bit about it from the community side. Oh, okay. You missed this one then, I guess. But the proposal at that point was actually to substantially change the walkway system and the paving in the park. I think it was well intentioned. The point was to have more community gathering space, more places for people to come together in the center of the park, make it a little bit more pedestrian friendly with these bulb outs to make the crosswalk a little bit shorter. More benches, kind of change to the landscape design overall for the park. But these were really major changes to the features of the park. So the city pretty immediately heard from the community that this was not what they were looking for, and really would not have been in conformance with the Secretary standards. Yeah, please. Yeah, so the question was who initiated this idea? And I was not around at this time, so please, if you have some insight, you can step in as well. But it's my understanding there was kind of a design collaborative as part of the historic district. So there was a little bit of community input, but it was primarily initiated by the city, recognizing that there were some maintenance issues with the park at that point. So this is a city park. So it's actually a city facility that is under the jurisdiction of our community services department. So it's my understanding it was primarily city initiated, but please jump in. And Susan Sequoia here in the front. There was a landscape architect hired by the city.
A landscape architect was hired by the city, and I think he came up with this creative solution.
Yeah, I think that's correct. There was a landscape architect that was hired by the city to redevelop a plan for the plaza that was looking at a couple of issues that the city felt were problems with the park that the community necessarily didn't agree with. Yes, we are fortunate to have a very pro-preservation city council and a mayor who is very, very involved in historic preservation, both now and at that time. Right. So having heard from the community that this was not a plan that was being supported, the city engaged a historic preservation consultant to take a look at the park as a whole, what were the character defining features of the park, and how to create a project that would actually be in conformance with the Secretary standards and meet what the city saw as kind of the maintenance issues with the park, and also what the community was looking for in terms of a public space at the center of the historic district. So through that effort, The consultant identified a number of character-defining features for the park as a whole. So that elliptical plan, that H-shaped pattern of walkways, and the integrally colored scored concrete. The mature trees throughout the park. The majority of the trees in the park were planted before 1950. Many of them in like 1905, 1910 range, and a series of roses planted throughout the park. The fountain itself from 1937, the basin and the tiered fountain at the center, the cast stone light standards that were throughout the park, the few remnants of the concrete curbs that were around the edges of the planting areas, the steel bollards that were around the exterior of the park, and the concrete and steel benches, and the flagpole at the center of the park. So those were the list of features that we were working with as character-defining features that were important to preserve the significance of the park as a whole. When we are talking about landscapes in particular and parks in general, we kind of had to decide what was the important period to interpret for this landscape, because we have plantings from the very earliest period of the park when it had a different fountain, no paving at all, different kinds of curbs. And then we had at the center and throughout the walkways that character from kind of the late 1930s, early 1940s. Basically, what we came to as a solution is that the interpretive period for the park should be basically 1937 to 1949. And that was based on the majority of the features that were still retained in the park, with the understanding that the trees and the landscaping would be maintained kind of continuously as part of that character. So we weren't attempting a restoration project to any particular time period. We weren't attempting to go back to the earlier fountain and the unpaved walkways. We were kind of recognizing the development of the park over time and how all of those features, including the landscape, have come together to create the park as it is today. So ultimately, the project involved a replacement of the deteriorated paving to match that integrally colored scored concrete throughout, maintaining the historic concrete curbs where they existed, and replacing them to match where they were missing. There are some areas throughout the park where the trees actually have encroached on those curbs, and the historic trees have encroached on those curbs. And where that occurs, we actually chose not to replace those curbs in those areas because that would have been damaging to the tree. So in those cases, we're kind of balancing the preservation of the landscape with a rehabilitation approach. The majority of the mature trees were preserved. The trees that were removed were one avocado, which was in very poor health, and the cypress trees around the fountain itself. I'm going to go back here. So this is 2001, just before the work started. You can see those cypress trees have been topped at some point. So they're starting to grow out instead of up. And even in the 1960s, you can see how they were really intended to be like kind of tall, narrow, untopped cypresses. So a decision was made to replace those trees so that they fit in a little bit more with the character of that little bit of landscape design that the plaza had from an earlier period. Here you can see them too, where they were really intended to fit in with, I think, the tall palms that were throughout the park. Here. So this is the plaza today. It is maintained, I mentioned, by our community services department. So the community services department has a series of specifications for how they maintain the fountain, how they maintain the walkways, how they're dealing with the trees and the plantings throughout the park. That were advised on by our historic preservation consultant and by planning staff, so that we're making sure that when they're doing maintenance projects in the park, that they're doing them in a way that's in conformance with the Secretary standards and with our design standards for Old Town. So we have an arborist look at the trees every couple of years to make sure that they're still in good health and that we're maintaining them the way they should be maintained. We have a very specific mold made for the finials so that we can, when we need to, we can exactly match the finials. We, unfortunately, because it's a roundabout and that's a little bit confusing for people late at night, we occasionally have people who drive into the park. So we have had some maintenance issues related to cleaning and repair of the walkways, and even, unfortunately, so they sometimes get as far as the basin on the fountain, in which case we're talking about specifications for cleaning and repairing the tile. That doesn't happen very often, but those are the kinds of things that we have to plan for from the maintenance side and the city side, and coordinating between historic preservation staff and our parks department to make sure that they're doing all of those things in a way that fits in with the Secretary standards. I hope you can take a walk. It's a really lovely little park.
All right, so to kind of take it all home, we figured we would end with where I think most of us are most closely acquainted, which is dealing with single-family residential. The majority of our historic district is single-family residential. And most of the projects that we review have to do, especially these days, have to do with either rehabilitation or rehabilitation and additions to single-family homes. The majority of the homes in Old Town are kind of on the smaller side compared to what most people expect as your standard single-family home today. So especially things like master bath additions come up pretty frequently. As we kind of talked at the beginning of the presentation, or Marissa mentioned, while the Secretary of Interior standards kind of give you a framework in which you should, either undertake rehabilitations or restorations or preservation, it really comes down to how each community wants to interpret and apply those standards, because there's really no firm right or wrong way to do it. So as Marissa mentioned, here in orange, we tend to take a more conservative approach on how we make modifications to buildings, especially single-family homes. And this is a particular project I worked on very recently where a lot of those different standards came into play when we were trying to review what to do with this property. So this is what started life as a hipped roof cottage constructed between around 1909 and 1922. It is located in the northeast quadrant of our historic district, which is predominantly single-family residential. It doesn't have that kind of mixed-use character that some of the other western quadrants of the district have. And was recently purchased by an owner who wanted to kind of do some work in order to kind of not only kind of try to bring the house back to more of its historic character, but also add on. So this is a picture of the home as it sits today. You can already kind of tell looking at it, it's had some interesting modifications over time. So at some point, the porch posts on the front of the home were replaced with kind of those 60s wrought iron columns that were super popular around that time. This is a common modification that we kind of see here in Old Town. People who just kind of around the time wanted to spiff their homes up, make them look a little more contemporary. So we'd make a kind of a simple change like this. I've seen this done on a craftsman house in Old Town, and let me tell you how out of scale that looks compared to the giant roof of the Craftsman. Other changes you can see in this photograph are the roof had been replaced. It was originally wood shake that had been changed to composition shingle. What's on there now is actually molded metal meant to look like barrel tile. So I'd never even seen that before, and it's definitely not very in character with the kind of more early 20th century style of the home. On this is just another view of the front of the home, so you can kind of get an idea of what that kind of new porch alteration was. And then in this photo, you can kind of see the peak of one of the biggest changes to the property. So in 1969, someone put an addition on the home. It's actually kind of a shed roof, board and batten addition. It was kind of a rumpus room and bedroom addition to the house. This kind of sits directly on the side of the building. It kind of looks like someone sidled a single wide up to the house and just attached it. It does have wood windows, but it's kind of a mix of wood picture windows and jalousie windows. And so really didn't have any connection to what was going on the original bungalow, which besides the porch and the roof actually maintains a lot of its original features, like its window openings, its siding, and its eave details. So this is what the addition looks from the side. Once you get to the back, it gets even crazier. So this is the back of that addition, which kind of sticks out as a long, and I have a picture of the site plan for you to look at, but kind of sticks out like a long addition that has this kind of porch cover, which then attaches to the main home. And this is the original detached garage. So it's kind of hard to capture in pictures how weird this looks in person. So this is kind of the space now between the addition, the house, and the garage that was created, and then shows kind of how that patio cover had then been attached to the rear of the bungalow. So this is the house that the property owner kind of started with. And to give you an idea so this is the site plan as it sits today, with the original footprint of the bungalow, the addition that had been put on, and the shaded area kind of shows for you where that whole patio cover was attached. So when the property owner came to us wanting to be able to make modifications to the property, we had to kind of first look at the house, establish what kind of the level of integrity of the home is right now, what features that we can consider character defining still remain, and what modifications might be appropriate to the house in the framework of our design guidelines and the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation, because we're at the point where this isn't preservation, this is not restoration, it's going to be a rehabilitation project. So the scope of work that the property owner was interested in was removing that whole patio cover thing. They wanted to be able to add a small master bath addition to the back of the existing addition. And then the biggest change was really going to be they wanted to be able to essentially completely change the look of that 1969 addition, to add on a hip roof, go from the shed roof to a hip roof, similar in pitch to the existing bungalow. And they wanted to replace the board and batten siding with lap siding. So this is an idea, it gives you an idea. This project's not constructed yet, so I can't give you after photographs, but this is the copy from the drawings. Oh, and they wanted to be able to replace those 1960s porch posts with a more period appropriate wood post. So looking at this, there are a lot of things that we had to consider. And one of them was, in making modifications to these different parts of the buildings that have been added on, what's the significance of that addition that's already been put on? Are the changes that they're going to be making going to be creating any sort of false sense of history to the property? And then are these modifications and additions going to further deteriorate what historic integrity the bungalow had left? So this was a project that was reviewed by our design review committee, and the conclusion that we came to was a lot of these modifications we felt would either be hard to mistake for original fabric on the building, and would be differentiated enough that we felt that the original bungalow could still stand alone as a contributing historic building. So things that we asked them to do is we felt that even though we did not have a photograph showing us what the original porch posts on the building look like, we have several other examples of this style of architecture in Orange. And we would be comfortable with the idea of them replacing it with some sort of simple wood posts that would probably mirror what would have been more appropriate to the building when it was originally constructed. We got on board with the idea of replacing the board and batten siding on the existing addition with lap siding, as long as it would be of a different profile than the one that's on the historic home, to differentiate it. The pitch of the roof was also brought down to a lower pitch than that on the original bungalow to further differentiate it. These are two examples of things that are we commonly approve in Orange as additions that you could differentiate further and still be within the scope of the standards. But as Marissa said, we tend to take a more conservative approach to how we detail additions. So we kind of said that based on the location of the existing addition, there's probably a very low chance someone would ever think that that addition was original to the property, just because of the way that it's attached and engaged to the original bungalow. And with those changes to the profile of the siding and the pitch of the roof, it would be close enough, it would be further differentiated enough that nobody would mistake it as historic. But this is a very common type of project that we have, and a really good example of how we tend to approach these additions. I have worked in other jurisdictions where completely different siding is encouraged. I would have probably been okay with the board and batten siding staying, but we also have a community here that also tends to favor additions and modifications to be made to be more of a historical nature, so they don't stand out as much as new. And that is still acceptable within the standards. It's a spectrum in what you're comfortable doing. And this is very typical of what we do here in Orange. So that is our community development mission statement, just so you can see that we do take preservation into consideration all the projects that we do here. Marissa and I can answer any questions that you guys might have on any of the projects that we presented, or just any questions in general about Orange's historic district or our planning documents.
Okay, I think I'll start us off because I should move away from this. Okay, I can sort of summarize the question, even though I don't have it in front of me. The question was in relation to the new state bill. I think it's SB 771. I'm not good with state bill numbers. It's in regards to accessory dwelling units, which now mandates, ministerial approval for projects that that allow people to build granny flats units either in the rear or in the front, maybe garage units. And I think the question really was, like, what sort of standards, maybe you as Orange, what are you thinking of in terms of how to react to this new law, and what sort of standards to put in place?
Sure. So just recently, within the last couple of months, the city put forward a revision to our existing accessory dwelling unit regulations in the municipal code to try to come into conformance with the most recent state law standards. And obviously, when we were reviewing the new law, not only for the planning department, but the legal department or city attorney's office was very concerned about what implications that might have on our ability to do discretionary design review in the historic districts. It's our understanding that a lot of cities are interpreting that as ministerial review is required now. However, our city attorney has actually taken a stance that a lot of what is put in the new state law can be interpreted as optional. And for the time being, while we are obviously adopting all the new regulations related to parking requirements and unit size, we are interpreting that our current regulations allow us to have discretionary review over accessory dwelling unit appearance, not the fact of them existing in the historic district. That's always been allowed by right. So we are going to continue to review them the appearance of those accessory dwelling units per our design standards until we're told otherwise.
Yeah, I would just add to that, the basis of our city attorney's interpretation is founded in our design standards, actually. Our design standards say that we're required to have the design review committee at a public meeting look at any kind of addition or new construction in the historic district. So we are not specifically calling out accessory dwelling units. It's an addition, a new garage, an accessory dwelling unit, whatever it is that is new construction requires design review. So based on that interpretation, we are continuing with a design review process for the accessory dwelling units.
Okay, and maybe a bit of a follow-up to that is, are you thinking of ways to be creative in how to increase the housing stock other than through accessory dwelling units, or maybe providing, and this is, I'm quoting from the question, providing more flexibility when it comes to rear garage units or places where there's not as much of an impact on a historic district from the street view when it comes to accessory dwelling units?
I would describe that as a sensitive topic in our historic district. Chapman University is a major part of the Old Town Historic District. And Old Town in particular has seen a lot of pressure from student housing. So there's a balance between students living in the neighborhood and kind of just the community and neighborhood character of the historic district. So certainly we're complying with state law in terms of accessory dwelling units. I would say in terms of development pressure, we're fortunate that the majority of the historic district is already zoned single-family residential. So there, just in the general zoning code, there's kind of limited ability for adding additional units. And the city is trying to work very closely with Chapman University on developing student housing that is part of the Chapman University campus to relieve some of that pressure on the historic district in general.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
Now I'm going to open it up to, that was the only question from the remote audience, so I'll open it up to everybody else.
In light of the new state law on that subject, would you rather see a accessory or a second dwelling that's detached from the structure rather than an extension of the existing structure?
So as far as the way that it's worked out in Old Town, most proposals we've gotten for new accessory dwelling units have been detached. Sometimes that is difficult, especially if the property already has a detached building, because like a garage or carriage house, because then you're kind of balancing how much of the lot's going to be covered in buildings, not only buildings, detached buildings, and the distances between those, you know, not just to meet zoning code development requirements, but also building code requirements. I don't know that as a department, we've really favored one or the other. We've had people do attached units. We've had people do detached. We don't really see it any different than anyone who wants to do any other kind of rear addition on their property, be it a master bedroom or a new unit. So we would review them the same way, making sure that whatever that addition is going to be is going to be differentiated and kind of secondary to whatever the primary residence is. I think one of the big things that the new state law has done to help relieve pressure on people who want to do accessory dwelling units in Old Town is the removal of being able to request additional off-street parking. That was something that stopped a lot of people, not only in Old Town, but other parts of the city from being able to do that accessory unit. But now state law does require that we cannot require any additional off-street parking for new accessory dwelling units anymore. So now someone can build that. It doesn't matter whether they have a garage space or a on-site space for that unit or not.
As far as differentiating the new structure, I mean, how far can you go? Can you have a 1920s Craftsman existing structure that's designated, then somebody would recall or put in like a dwell design type of structure in the back, you know, something totally modern? How far can you go with that differentiation between the main house?
So Marissa can speak to this as well. We haven't really had that boundary tested at all in Old Town. When people are coming into these additions or accessory dwelling units, most of them are would ideally do something that exactly matches the house, and you would never be able to tell that it was ever an addition, which, isn't in compliance with the Secretary's standards. So most people are coming in with either something like the project I showed you that kind of has nods to a differentiation, but still fits in the mass scale and general palette of materials of what's on the property already. I think that's sort of what we would encourage people to do. It doesn't need to be an exact duplicate of what's there, but we want something that's going to fit in the general landscape of the historic district as a whole, since we really don't have a lot of things, like you said, that are that kind of dwell, more contemporary and modern style. Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think that covers it. I mean, we are much more often in the position of pushing people toward greater differentiation than having to pull people back from that position. I think a very, very contemporary addition or unit in the back of a kind of small historic residence in Old Town would be a difficult sell, I think, for our community and for our design review committee. But I do think we are starting to see a little bit more creativity in the detailing of some of these projects that might help to push us in that direction.
This is totally off subject, but how carefully do you scrutinize landscape architecture along with the designated building? Has that ever been designated as well as the structure on the property?
This has been a recent large topic, actually. So we don't review landscape plans for residential projects, at least for single-family residential projects in the historic district. We have some kind of general guidance and recommendations about maintaining parkway and front yard plantings. The city also has a tree preservation ordinance and an actual list of historic trees that are protected under a separate section of the municipal code. But we are not looking at the details of planting pallets and how people are arranging plantings in their front yards.
And I think I'll also add to that is CPF is working on a model ordinance, and the bill allows for communities to draft their own ordinances, I believe, when it comes to design review. Maybe you can confirm on that or not, or I don't know. But we have some attorneys on our board who are drafting a model ordinance for cities to respond to this new law. One that both allows for affordable housing, but also respects the character of historic districts. And we're still working that out. So just for information, follow our website if you want to see more updates. Any further questions?
Hi, Marissa.
Hi.
A question for you regarding state mandates, because I've worked in other cities as well. And for instance, the Coachella Valley, when it comes to solar panels, will not even bring it before an advisory committee. It's rubber stamped over the counter. And that is very contentious with adjacent neighbors and so forth. How's it being handled within this historic district?
So we have in our design standards, in both the existing and the proposal for the update, provisions specifically for solar panels. Basically, they don't talk about visibility of the installation from the street or from other surrounding properties. What the design standards say currently is that you can have solar panels on the rear 50% of your house if you are on an interior lot, or the interior 25% of your roof if you're on a corner lot. So in some cases, depending on the way your roof is shaped, those are going to be visible from the street and from your neighbors. And we've definitely heard from the community that that's a concern. This is another topic that our city attorney has weighed in on because of the Solar Rights Act. Basically, the way we interpret it is because we have these provisions in our design standards, if you're meeting the requirements that are in the design standards, you can be approved over the counter. whether or not they're visible from the street. If you want to propose a different location, then you're required to go before our design review committee. And our city attorney has said that that's an acceptable practice, even to require that kind of discretionary review, because it's part of our design standards for the historic district. There is a little bit of leeway, it's my understanding, in the Solar Rights Act to request modifications to solar installations, as long as they are not decreasing the efficiency of the system more than 10% or increasing the cost of the system more than $1,000. So we use those provisions even at the counter to kind of guide people toward a better solution for solar panels, but it's certainly a challenge.
One thing I'll ask is, I really liked your plaza example, and to see all of the, I was looking for a landscaping example for this workshop because I want people to understand cultural landscapes, and I don't know if I would quite. It's a little bit, it's a different kind of cultural landscape, and maybe you can talk a little bit about, what interested me was you mentioned that you gave the priority to the trees over the built components of the landscape. You allowed the trees to sort of live their lives, and then replace in kind when that tree died, for example. What made you decide that, okay, the tree is more important than the planting or the sidewalk and the built components of the landscape, and why did you prioritize vegetation over those other components?
I think it's a combination of things. It's partly the age of the trees. At that point, many of those trees were approaching 100 years old. So they're really specimen trees, really unique, and spoke to kind of that earliest development of the city and how the community has cared for that park over those 100 years. So the trees really help to tell the story of kind of the development of the park over time. And the hardscape features are things that are easier to repair and replace over time. That 100-year-old tree, if it dies tomorrow, will take another 100 years to get to that same canopy. But a concrete curb we can replace really at any time, because we know how to do that to make it match and to make it look in kind. So just based on kind of the living character of the park and the history that it represents, and I think also the interest from the community in that canopy and the history of the trees were what came to the fore.
Okay, any further questions?